In this video, we're going to practice using Fusion 360 Forms to model a golf driver. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to take a look at using forms to model something that's not car related. In this case, we're looking at a golf club. Now, specifically, we're looking at a driver because a lot of these have very organic shapes. There are a lot of features on them. And this is a request that came in. Somebody was asking about modeling a golf driver. Now, this is actually something I've done in the past. Many years ago, I was supporting SolidWorks and power surfacing for SolidWorks, and I did a tutorial on modeling a golf driver with that. However, I haven't done it in Fusion, so we're going to go in and take a look at the process that I follow and just see what the result is. Now, I will say I don't have any images to add of a golf driver. Most of the stock photo you need to pay for, so it's not something that I can freely distribute. So I suggest that you just go into your web browser, Google or search images for different drivers, and just use them as inspiration. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with a new design. I'm not going to be following any sort of size or scale because we're really just looking at the general size and shape. But the first thing that I want to do is I want to create the shaft of the club. So we're going to use associative match at some point to help drive the shape. So we're going to start with a sketch, pick whatever plane you want, and I'm just going to do a rough shape. So this is going to be the angle that it comes in, and what we're going to do is we're going to make a revolve. So we're just going to sort of make a rectangular section. We can taper it in if we want here. I'm going to hold down Control so I don't snap to horizontal, and then I'm going to make a parallel edge here. And again, we're really not too worried about actual dimensions. All I want to do is get something I can revolve. So I'm just going to put a perpendicular constraint here. I really don't even care if it is to scale or not. So again, that's my starting point. We're going to revolve this as a solid. And now this is going to be the fiberglass portion that goes up to the part you hold. And this is going to be the section that goes down to the rest of the club that we're building. All right, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and jump into creating a form. Now, one of the hardest things whenever you're starting a new design on, just any form body is figuring out the starting shape. Now, a lot of times with cars, I'll go to plane or face. These are going to be my go-to because I build a small section at a time. And obviously we use cylinders for things like the wheel arches. With a golf club, it's not really clear whether or not we want to start with individual faces or if we want to start with some predefined shape. Now, one of the rules that I use is what is the shape that we're trying to create? Now, if the shape that we're trying to create already is close to something we have, then that's what I'll use. Now, drivers are an interesting shape. We could start with individual faces. We could start with a box. We could even start with a quad ball. Now, the things that I would avoid in this case would be cylinders and spheres and the torus. I wouldn't use any of those three for this. And the reason behind that is because the sphere ends at a single vertex at the top, so you get a lot of triangular sections and you get a star point at the top. It's not going to be very helpful for us. The cylinder is going to be open on the ends, and if we try to close it, we're going to have the same issue we have with the sphere. And the torus just is not even in the same ballpark as the shapes that we're trying to create. So for me, I would look at whatever reference images I have, and I would either start with a quad ball or I'd start with a box. Those are going to be the two easiest ones. For this example, since we don't use quad ball very often, I'm going to start with that. I'm just going to select a plane and don't really worry about the scale or the size. But one thing you do want to think about is going to be the rotation. So I'm going to just say, okay, no symmetry for now. I'm going to select everything, go to modify, edit form. And the reason I want to think about the rotation is because we're going to have to get some of these faces to attach to our club. So first off, I need to move it into roughly where the shape is going to be. So I'm just going to sort of pull it down here. I could have planned out my revolve a little better, but we're freeform modeling here. The coordinate system is not that critical. However, it is important that we do understand the orientation because X, Y, and Z are important to us for rotating, pulling, and scaling things. And when we look at this quad ball right now, we've got an edge in the vertical direction, an edge in the horizontal direction. And you can kind of see the way that the shape works out is we've got these four-sided faces right in the middle. So what I want to do is I'm going to rotate this thing 45 degrees, which should perfectly put the other line vertical, which means it's still aligned with X, Y, and Z, but now it's a little bit more in line with the shape of the club itself. So this just helps me set up my model. The next thing I want to do is I want to start to scale it to get the rough shape in mind. So, again, we're just kind of working in plane. We're looking at how this thing looks. I'm going to scale it backwards, maybe move the entire thing backwards. And there we're done. That looks just like a golf club. So now that we've got it in place, the next thing for me is I'm going to hit escape to get off my edit form tool, and I'm going to go into box display mode. Now, box display mode is going to be extremely important because we're going to take the time to sort of build out what this thing looks like in box display, and then we're going to use that to drive the shape in smooth display. So right now I don't want to go back to smooth display. I want to simply focus on box display. Now as we're looking at this, the location of the club is generally going to be closer to the face, the section of the club where you're hitting the ball. Now, full disclosure here, I am not a golfer, so if I use any of the terminology wrong, I do apologize there, but just keep in mind that we do want to get the orientation of this thing correct. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this back to about where I expect that face to be. Now that we've got it in line here, the next thing I want to do is I want to flatten up this front face, but I'm not going to do this simply by using the flatten tool. Now, I just recently did a video on the sort of 5 or 6 tools that you need to design anything. And I'm going to try to stick to that. So I'm going to use only the tools that I mentioned in there, which is going to be, in this case, it's going to be edit form. So I'm going to reset my pivot point all the way to the front. And then I want to scale this all the way down. And I'm going to manually enter 0 and then left click somewhere. Okay, so now I've got this whole thing that I can then, again, move back and sort of align. I can rotate around. Generally, the face of the club is going to be probably the biggest. So I'm going to take all of these. You'll notice automatically the pivot point is directly in the center. And I'm going to scale this out to be the shape of the face of the club. You'll notice it kind of seems like it's twisted a little bit. I don't really care too much about that. If we want to, one thing we can do is we can select these vertices and we can scale them down until they're 0, which would mean they're completely vertical. And we can do the same thing with these ones here. Now we're going to be doing a lot of manual manipulation, so having it perfectly in line is not critical at this stage, but if you want to sort of straighten them out, you can do that. All right, it's starting to look a little bit closer, a little bit better. Just for fun, I'm going to hop into smooth display, see what it looks like. And it is looking more like we would expect. However, because we have a flat front face, you're now seeing that the curvature is coming out and sort of dipping in and coming back out. We're going to fix that, so don't worry about that just yet. If you want to play around with it, we're not going to end up with a crease, but what we're going to do is we're going to take insert edge, and we're going to pull it really close to this one here, and then we're going to scale this up. Now, this is probably not something that's going to stay just yet, but we're going to scale it up just a little bit. I'm going to go 1.01 and hit enter. And if I go to smooth display, now you can see that we've sort of driven the face of the club to be a little bit more flat. It's not a perfect solution yet, and we do have these star points here, and these are going to be harder for us to control the shape. So you can kind of see that it's getting closer to that edge here, and then it's further away back here. We can use make uniform to maybe help that out a little bit. You can see that it sort of pulled it away from that edge. But again, these are all things that we're going to have to figure out as we go through the design. I'll leave it like that for now. We haven't saved it yet, so let's go ahead and do a quick save. And I'm just going to call this golf club. After I'm done with this design, I'll go ahead and I'll put the link to this in the description so you can download the model after the fact, depending on what it looks like. And but again, I don't have a starting point because I can't just grab an image, unfortunately. Okay, so now we've got the rough shape done. We need to do a little bit more on the face of the club. Now, the face of the club right now is fairly symmetric. Generally, they will not be. So I really want to focus on getting this portion of the design how I want it shaped, because that's going to drive the rest of the shape. So typically what we would see is that this is not a uniform shape. It's probably a little narrower where it attaches to the club. This over here is probably going to come up a bit. This portion here will come down but inward. And this portion here will come sort of down but inward. And again, you can go back and forth between smooth and box display. It's not really going to tell you a whole lot just yet, but you can do it if you want to. All right, so this looks pretty good for me. I think that probably want to bring this up and maybe this up, because it's going to be a little bit more round on this side here. And again, if we want to take a look, one thing that we can do is we can go back and forth between smooth and box display and just get a good idea of what it looks like. You can also use the sort of intermediate display. It shows the box cage on the outside, and then it shows the smooth display on the inside. Now, if you're not familiar, I know I switch back and forth between that a lot. If you're not familiar with that, it's the utilities display mode, and the shortcut keys, at least on a PC, are Alt and 1 and Alt and 3. You can also find it inside of Edit Form under the selection options. If you come down to the very bottom, you can switch back and forth in here. This does not affect the dialog box, so here, if I go back and forth between smooth and box display, it's fine. If you happen to click on a vertice and try to do Alt and 3 right now, something happened with Fusion that it affects the dialog box, so that's something you need to be aware of. All right, so I'm going to double click this edge and delete it. As I mentioned, it was kind of just added just to show you that edge control, but I really want to get the box shape done how I think it should look. So we're going to continue to work on that. So from the side, again, I'm just going to be moving in plane. I want the shape to come up and then back down. However, the up portion is going to be between these two edges. So right now, I'm not going to worry about that section coming up. I just want to worry about getting the general shape to look right. So that looks okay from the side. The back side of the driver is going to be fairly rounded, so the shape that automatically happened with that quad ball is probably okay. We just kind of need to worry about this intermediate shape. So it looks okay. And again, I'm going to switch to smooth display just to take a quick look to see if we're just in the right ballpark. Another thing you can do temporarily is you can take these front edges and crease them. Now, adding a crease, I did mention that this was sort of one that was outside of the top 5, and this is not how I'm going to proceed. But if you crease it, it will give you that sharp edge, and then you can come back and add a fillet later. Now, the way that golf clubs are, the face doesn't just have a fillet on them. It has a fairly flat face, but then it will round out. So again, this is not the direction we're going. But if you like working in smooth display, you can add that crease, and that'll help give you just a little bit of an idea there. So I'm going to Control Z to undo that, and I'm going to go back to box display. The next thing that I want to do once I'm happy with this shape, so again, box display, you want to make sure you're happy with the shape from the top, that it looks roughly like the driver, happy with the shape of the face from the front, and happy with the shape of the face from the side. Once you're happy with all those elements, then we're going to start to add more detail to begin to refine the shape. Now, keep in mind, there are a lot of little details on the driver. There are little recesses and cuts and things that happen. Those are details that you are not going to be adding in the form body. They're way too difficult. The level of detail that we have, we'd have to subdivide this thing to the moon, and it would just be insanely hard to manage. So we're going to still stick with the limited number of faces. As few faces as possible to get our shape. So now that we see what we have here, I'm going to go to Modify and Insert Edge, and I want to put an edge right in the middle here, which is going to be minus 0.5, and then I'm going to hit Enter to OK that. Now, the reason I'm going to hit Enter to OK that is because, as I've talked about in a lot of my other videos, when you use the simple insertion mode for something like this, it's just going to create a flat section. And we see this in box display. It's completely flat. And this is really bad for curvature. You do not want a completely flat section. It's not going to give you a nice result. It's going to be hard to see, but there's going to be a little bump that happens here, then it's going to bump back up. And part of the reason is because these edges are the tangency control for the curvature underneath. So we still have curvature continuity across those edges, but if this edge right here doesn't scale itself up a little bit or down a little bit, then we're not going to get a nice smooth transition surface. You're going to get a dip or a bump right in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale that up just a little bit. So again, I'm going to take this and I'll do 1.01. Just going to give it a little bit of a height increase. It might not be enough, but it does take that out just a little bit. Let's try to scale it up just a little bit more. I'll go 1.02, something a little bit more drastic. And then if we take a look at this in smooth display, so basically what we're doing is we're trying to get rid of the bump that happens in between there. Now, we're going to have to do that from a couple of different sides. And again, I'm not worried about the face right now. What I'm worried about is the general shape. We want to get the general shape just right. So everything looks okay from the top. If we want to control the transition a bit more, then we can begin to work on that. And the way that I would do that is I would select these two vertices and scale them apart. And then maybe select these two vertices and scale them apart. And right now, this is a very visual thing. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at the angle of these edges, and I either want them to taper toward each other or taper away from each other in a very gradual fashion, or in the case back here, stay parallel. If it's drastically different, so for example, if I push it like this, what's going to end up happening is the curvature in that area is going to be really bad. And you don't generally see this in smooth display when you don't have a high level of detail, but it is going to be very apparent in the final shape, especially if you start subdividing this thing. You'll notice that you start to have some issues with the curvature. So we want to be very mindful when we make these changes. We want to do just these gradual changes, try to keep the edges parallel or slightly converging or diverging. You don't want a very drastic change. Another thing I want to do is I want to make sure that this edge is going to be essentially flat. So I'm going to type in 0, scale it to 0 there, and that kind of makes sure that my midline is an actual midline. When we look at the driver from the side, now's the time if we want to make any adjustments to the shape here, if we want the shape to sort of be lower. What we can do is we can take this entire edge. So first thing I'm going to do, scale it down to 0. And then I'm going to take this entire edge. I'm going to set its pivot point at the front, which remember is perfectly flat still. So I'm going to set it at the front and the middle. And then I can start to angle that down. Now, what that's going to do is it's going to make sure that the edge at the front stays in the same location, and then all the other edges are going to slightly rotate down. It does produce a problem here, which we have to fix. But again, we can go in and we can take a look at the smooth display. And essentially what we're doing is we're starting to push that shape down. Now, if I do Control Z to undo that, and we keep it right in the middle, that's perfectly fine. But again, a lot of times what you're going to see with these drivers is the shape is not going to be consistent. It's going to be offset one direction or the other. I always prefer to do this in box display mode personally. That's how I prefer to model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this down. And again, I don't want everything perfectly flat, but one thing that we can do is we can set our pivot point at the front and we can begin to scale these down. And as long as we don't get to 0, they won't be perfectly flat. So we can get relatively close visually. And it's a bit easier sometimes than manually moving it around. Now this vertice right here is tricky because we've got sort of a matching one on the other side. So if you need to keep symmetry, you can certainly turn that on. I'm going to be manually modifying it because again, I know these things aren't symmetric. So what I'm looking at is for this edge right here. It's parallel up front, it starts to taper away, and then it tapers away just a little bit more as we get toward the back. And that's that visual cue that I'm looking for. And then up top, what I want to do is I want to taper this down a little bit more drastically, but I still want to maintain that sort of same parallel edges and then start to taper away. We're going to eventually add another edge in here, I feel. This is the first time that I'm going through this modeling it. So this is my process. This is how I go about it. So keep that in mind that I haven't pre-modeled this. I'm just kind of going in blind and showing you the process of how I go about this. All right, so that looks okay. Let's go ahead and hop into smooth display, just do a quick analyzation. Another thing I should mention, a lot of people that are modeling in other programs like to use multiple viewports, especially if you come from something like Blender. If you like modeling in this way, then you can use these multiple viewports and see the manipulation happen in all 4 screens. I don't generally like this. I end up just kind of moving my model around a lot more. But I know a lot of people do like this modeling approach. So if you're coming from any program where you typically model in this fashion, then you can do that in Fusion. You can turn that on. And again, that's just going to this display option for the viewports and either setting up 4 views or doing a single view. So again, I'm going to stick to the single view. That's just how I like to model, but that is an option for people. I think I'm going to bring this vertex down a little bit and then take a look. So that's looking okay. I mean, that's not perfect, but it's looking okay. I'm happy with the shape. On the bottom, I think that I want to widen the bottom out a little bit. So I'm going to move these only in the X direction because I've already worked on their position in 3D. So I'm just going to sort of manipulate these in just the X direction. I'm going to do the same thing over here. And what this is going to allow me to do is give me a better reference for flattening out that bottom. So again, I really want to sort of emphasize or drive the point that working in box display mode is going to get the shape that you want. So you want the thing that you're looking at, the thing you're creating, you want the shape in box display to be representative of the skeleton of that structure. All right, so the next step in this process, once we're happy with the box display, once we're good with the overall shape, now is the time when we need to start adding our control. Now, what I mean by control, again, if you're kind of new here, if this is the first forms video that you've seen that I've done, this is a topic that we have talked about quite a bit. We've talked about inserting edges, inserting points, how to control sharp edges. And this is the point in the design where we're starting to add more detail. Once we add more detail, it's going to be much harder for us to change the shape. So this is why I say work in box display, be happy with the shape in box display. Don't worry so much about what it looks like in smooth display yet, because now is the point where we start to control that. So some things that we need to think about are going to be where we need edge control. Like we want to tighten up the transition in the front, and we also want to tighten up the transition on all these edges. Now I'm going to start by doing it at the front, so I'll double click this edge. I'm going to go to Insert Edge, and I'm going to push it relatively close to the front. The closer this edge is going to be to the front, the tighter the transition is going to be. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't I just click that front edge and insert it there? Well, it's because it's not a complete loop in the same sense that this is a complete loop. We can double click on it. We can use it as a complete loop. Now that we have this, if I take a look at this in smooth display, it's not going to be quite right. And what I want to do is I want to double click on this, and I want to get all the edges, which means that I need to go all the way around. And I also could just select the faces, that would be fine. But what I want to do is I want to scale those down. So now that I've inserted that edge, I'm going to scale the front down just a little bit, rotate it around, make sure that's okay. I know it's kind of crazy, this modeling approach, when you're working in mesh or you're working in forms like this, it requires a lot of rotation, and it can be kind of tricky. So I do try to minimize the amount of rotation, but I know it's kind of hard to follow sometimes. All right, so now that we've shrunken that down, the transition looks pretty good, but I want to add just one more. So what I'm going to do is going to go to Insert Edge one more time. And remember, this simple insertion mode is going to put it exactly where we tell it, and it's going to be perfectly flat between. If we try to use the exact insertion mode, it is going to change the shape. Now, what I mean by change the shape, it's going to change it in box display. Sometimes it's going to subdivide it more. Essentially what it's doing is it's keeping the shape exactly like it is and inserting the edge where you tell it to. So I typically will go for simple insertion mode, and I will manually edit these edges. So now I'm going to take this one, and this one is going to get scaled up slightly. Remember, we don't want it to be completely flat. So it needs to be a very minor scale. We don't want it to be bigger than the other edge. So I'm going to do 1.01 and just see what that looks like visually. You'll have to look at it from the side. And you can see here that's a little bit bigger than this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one and scale this one out as well. So I'm going to do 1.01 there, just to pop it up just a little bit more. And what we're looking for is, we don't want these two edges to be collinear. We don't want them to be straight. We want a little bit of angle between them. So if I look at this in smooth display, we can see that now we're controlling that edge a bit better. I'm going to use Control and 4 on my keyboard to hide the edges to show that this is not a perfect solution. We're not done with this yet, but it does allow us to sort of control those edges. Before we get on to controlling the edges flowing back, I do want to talk about retopologizing this so that the transition is tighter in certain areas and less in others. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use insert point. Now, insert point is very similar to insert edge. However, it allows us to pick points where we want these to go. So first, I'm going to start from the top. So as I'm looking at this, I want the transition that we created with these edges to sort of be what it is right in the middle, and I want it to fade away toward the edge. So I'm going to start here, and I'm going to begin widening this edge out. I'm going to work my way around, and I'm going to just come around the bottom here, and I'm going to tighten it back up as we get back around to here. Now, the reason that I'm doing this is because now I'm going to select that and delete it, and then we're going to take a look at this thing in smooth display. So if I hide the edges, what we're doing is we're taking this, let's try to zoom in here, we're taking this tight transition and we're starting to pull it away. Now, you might be thinking it doesn't look that different, and you would be completely right. And the reason it doesn't look that different is because we have this extra edge in here, that edge that's tightening it up. So we need to do the same thing with that one as well. So I'm going to start here, and this time I can go directly in the middle, which will be the red dot on these edges. And I can just work my way around. This is a really quick way to do it. And we'll just follow the same process. We're retopologizing this, and then I'm going to come back to that point, double click this and hit delete, and then I'm going to take a look at it in smooth display. And again, Control and 4, I'm going to hide my edges. So now that transition is tighter at the top. You can see right here it's tighter, and then it sort of gets smoother on the outside. Now, one last thing that we need to do on that is we need to use Make Uniform, and that's going to have a little bit more of a drastic effect. So if we bring back the edges and we do Control Z, we can see here is the before Make Uniform and the after Make Uniform. Now, this is a tool that oftentimes is very helpful when we're talking about using it on car bodies, but you can see in this case how drastic the difference is. And part of the reason is you can see how far that center moved. If we look at this in box display, this is what we designed, and this is where it is in smooth display. So Make Uniform is taking all of that and stretching it back out to be that more uniform shape that we created. So it is important that we use it, but it's also important that we think about the consequences. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take these front vertices and I'm going to scale them down a little bit, tighten that up. Then I'm also going to move them inward slightly. Now, the reason I'm doing that is, again, I'm trying to soften that outside edge just a little bit. All right. So now let's go ahead and do a quick save. We haven't saved it in a little bit. But now as we look at this, the shape of the driver is kind of offset, right? So this whole thing is essentially backwards. So this piece here really should be on the other side. Now, if you make this mistake and you're designing and you kind of get into the groove of moving things around, and your reference over here is not exactly where you wanted it. So right now it's a left-handed driver, and maybe I wanted to make a right-handed driver and I just wasn't thinking. We can always finish the form We can go back to this sketch and redo that, or we can just use move bodies and make sure we select body. I'm going to reset my pivot point. I'm going to turn on my origin. I'm going to set my pivot point here. And then I'm going to rotate this thing around and then just move it where I want it. We'll say OK. And that move happened after the form. So if I double click this form, you'd think that the move should flip it back to the other position, but it actually stays for whatever reason. If you want to, just for your own sanity, you can change that move and put it before the form body, but for whatever reason, that reference just kind of stays where it is. So that kind of helps us, especially if we were designing and we kind of got the shape a little off, or we decided that it needed to be right hand, not left hand, then we can do that. Now we could also just mirror things. We could create a mirror version of this body and just delete the original. So you could take the entire form body, you can copy, and then you can paste it. And then we've got this sort of exact copy right here. And then what we could do is we can mirror that entire thing and delete the original. I'm not going to do that, but that is an option. We could just copy and mirror things around. Okay, so now things are looking pretty good. We've got the rough driver shape, but I want a little bit more detail here. I want a little bit more shape. Now the thing, when I'm looking at the shape, the thing that I am seeing that is going to be problematic is this star point. Now this is where we have either 3 or 5 edges or more. In the case of things like the sphere or the cylinder, we're going to have more than 5 edges coming together. But this is going to cause a problem for me in terms of geometry. So what I want to do is first I want to try to control the shape. I want to tighten the shape up. So I'm going to do that by taking this midline and I'm going to insert an edge. And for right now, I'm going to put it right in the middle. And when I do it, again, it messes up a few things because it puts it completely flat. Now that completely flat means that we need to go and do a bunch of manual manipulation. So I'm going to go ahead and just start moving points around a little bit. So I'm going to do this from the back side. This is going to move in plane. This one will move in plane. We could scale this out as well, but sometimes this exercise is helpful because it lets you work on the geometry a little bit more sort of closely and make sure that things are still right. And then when we go to the front, this is where things will get tricky. I need to take this entire edge and sort of pull it out. This one, pull it out a little bit. You'll notice that I'm not making drastic changes here. These are very minimal changes, but they are important. We want to make sure that these things are not completely flat. And again, because it has a negative effect on the geometry. Now the front being completely flat, that's kind of a different story. Now ultimately what's going to happen is if you need a perfectly flat face or a very specific curve to the face, then you're going to do that after the fact anyways. You're going to cut off the front of this thing or add to it or whatever you need to. All right, so now that we got that midline in there, I'm going to take a look at this in smooth display, Control and 4 to hide my edges. Now, what we're seeing here is we've added this extra bump in the shape. Now it looks like it's bumping in and out, and part of that is because of this right here. This is not drastic enough to prevent that from happening. You can see here if I move it out, it looks a little bit better. Now if we want that transition to be tighter, then what we need to do is we need to add another edge. Now in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this out. I'm going to pull that out. And then I'm going to take that vertex and pull it out. Take a look at it in smooth display. That shape is looking okay. And I need to just double check it from the back side as well. Make sure that this vertex is going to go out. And again, I'm still looking at the relationship between these edges. You can see that these sort of cross, and I want to bring this one in a little bit. But these two, the angle between them, they're going away from each other. And as we transition to the next set of faces, the angle increases a little bit more. It's not drastic, but it increases a little bit more. And again, we want to pull this out and probably do the same thing over here. And also remember to look at it from the top because we're moving these edges in plane, but it's also a good idea in this view for these edges to stay in line. And I know that kind of seems like it goes against what I was just saying, but them being in line from this top view is different from the direction of curvature of them being in line. So again, the shape is looking better, and we're going to repeat that process down low. We want to move the bottom edges out. So again, what ends up happening is we have to manually manipulate these things from sort of the different positions. But for the next curve, when we do this on the bottom end, I'm actually going to push it down a bit further. Then we're going to stay in box display mode, but we're going to double click this entire edge. We're going to put the pivot point at the front because the pivot point is going to dictate where we move and scale from. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale this out a little bit in both X and Y. And this might get me a bit closer without having to manually edit everything. So that looks okay from here. Look at it from the bottom. This vertex might need a little bit of work, so I can do that manually. Maybe pull this one in. And everything else looks okay. So a little bit less manual work for that, but you can see that we've got a result. So we've tightened up the midline a little bit. So you can see we've got a slight curve here, and then we've got these tighter transitions at the bottom. I'm going to leave this side more rounded, just the general shape of it. But you can see we're starting to make some progress in the overall shape. We've added a bit more detail to the back, and it's starting to look okay. Now, again, as I mentioned before, the more detail you add, the harder the shape becomes to edit. So at this point, if I want to drastically change the shape, it's going to be a much more difficult process for me. So you're going to need to use very careful manipulation of edges to be able to get that shape to change. It's not impossible, but it does take a bit more work. Now, one thing I'm not happy with right now is the transition up top, so I'm going to pull that down a little bit, and I think that looks a little bit better. Okay, so we're getting pretty close to a final shape. You might notice that there looks like there's a little bit of an artifact that's here, and the reason that is because anytime you convert a form body to a solid or a surface and then you come back to edit, that body or the ghosted image of that body is there. Now, it can be helpful if you're making very minor changes, but it can be a pain if you're really trying to work hard on it. So what I want to do is just hide that, then come back in, and now that ghosted body is not there anymore. All right, let's do another quick save. And let's see what refinements we want to make before we do some detail work on this. Now, we still need to attach to this. I'm not quite ready for that to happen yet, but that is something we need to be mindful of, and that's going to affect the curvature. So you should be extra sure on the shape before you get to that stage. And for me, I want to make a couple more changes. I want to take this back and up, and I take this one back and up a little bit, and I'm going to do that back here. Sort of move things around a little bit. I like to stay either in a single direction or stay in plane. That's always important to me. We'll do it from the other side. This side looks okay. If you notice any issues with these edges, you can always scale them down to 0 if you want to keep them in line. It's not strictly required, but it is helpful from sort of a geometry standpoint to do that every once in a while. Let's take a quick look at it. The other thing I notice is we might want to insert another edge here to control the shape a little bit more. The way that it slopes off might not be as natural. So we can double click this edge. We'll insert it. It's always a good idea to stay in the 50% range if you can to make the size of these faces consistent. I'm going to take that edge. I'm going to scale it down to 0. And then I want to come around to the back side, and I want to scale it up in plane and then look at it from all sides. Again, we're looking at gradual transitions. I think that looks pretty good. We should do one more make uniform before we get too far. And you can see that made those consistent. And let's take a look at in box. Maybe scale that up just a little bit more. And what I'm going to do here is move the pivot to the bottom. And I want to scale this up vertically. I want to push the shape up, but I don't want to push it down. So scaling it up vertically will help me achieve that. All right, so that's pretty gradual, pretty good. I think we've got a good number of divisions going down the shape. You'll notice from left to right, we kept the size of these faces fairly big because we didn't really need to have any drastic change in the shape in that direction. At this stage, any changes need to be done to entire edge sections. So for example, if I want to taper this in, I'm going to box select these edges, and note that my selection dialog under filters, I have select through, which will let me grab those edges that are underneath. Another thing that we can do is we can turn on soft modification, which is going to determine how far away from our current selection, let's say 50 millimeters. If I go up to, let's say 100, what's going to happen is it's going to move additional faces. Now, the reason this is helpful is because we have a rectangular face count, and this allows me to pick the number of faces in a specific direction. So 0 in that direction, but 3 in this direction means that I'm moving that entire edge together. But this is based on my current selection. So these are tools that can be very helpful if you want to make more gradual changes. For me, I'm going to select those and sort of pull them in a little bit. This one here, pull it in. As you pull this one in, you might want to rotate it slightly and then take a look. So we're getting it to lean that way a little bit. In order to make this consistent, we want to make sure that this is not straight, which is kind of what we're always talking about. We want to make that more gradual. That looks pretty good. Keep in mind as we're looking at this, this is always the problem with these types of exercises, is we're looking at a very expedited version of the process. For actually designing something like this, we're talking about hundreds of hours. We're really looking at big shapes, big changes, and big details. But once you get those big details out of the way, the small details that go into designing products like this, they take a good bit of time. There's really not a shortcut to that process. So keep in mind that when we do these videos and we look at things like modeling cars, right? We're looking at a very small subset of the process, and there's really no shortcut for all the detail work that happens. So one thing I want to do is I want to make just some final manipulations here. I'm just kind of looking at these edges. Doesn't need to be perfect for what we're doing, but having the experience or having the sort of the seat time of just looking at the flow of these edges and these faces, as we look at like this grouping of faces here, as they get closer to the front, they're getting a little bit bigger. As they get closer to here, they're getting smaller. And that's based on the curvature, the changing curvature that we needed on this design. So just keep in mind that there are, some of these things that we need to do. I think what I want to do is I want to push this edge back a little bit. So we can use a tool called slide edge. And again, if I'm sticking strictly to the sort of 5 or 6 tools that I mentioned, slide edge wasn't one of those. It was kind of on the extra. So a way that we can do this is we can insert an edge and put it about where we want it, keeping in mind that this is an average between this edge and the next edge. So it's trying to keep it essentially parallel. And then I can select this one and delete it. So what we're doing is we're sort of smoothing that transition out. Once again, after we do this, it's always important that we try and make uniform to get those, things pushed back out. Let's just check the shape real quick. I don't really like what's happening in this corner, so that's something that I want to fix. And as I look at it, probably means that I need to just do some manual tweaks. Everything looks okay from this angle, and it looks okay from the side angle. But I think what I want to do is I want to take this edge and I want to move it. So I'm going to move it back just a little bit. and take this front edge and delete it, and then just take one more look. So if I hide my edges, you can still see that it looks like there's almost like a pinch artifact there, just based on the topology. And that's really because of how far these edges are away. So a way that we would tighten that up is we're going to go to Insert Point. I'm going to come down to here, and then over to this edge, and then delete this one. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to tighten up that transition there. Once again, I'll go to Make Uniform. It's looking a little bit better, but I think I need a little bit more control on the front face. So what that means is I'm going to insert another edge. I'm going to pull it forward. And then we need to worry about its scale. So again, I'm going to take a look at this from the side. I'm going to scale that up slightly. 1.005 should be enough. That's in the vertical direction. We might want to manually make some more drastic changes in certain areas, like over here. Let's go ahead and move this one around. And let's just take a look at the result. So that, to me, that looks better. So before we had this weird dip artifact that was happening, and basically we just didn't have enough curvature control in that area. We needed more edges to help control it. Now that looks a bit better. It's more crisp. These edges over here look okay. We could do a bit more, but they look okay. So let's do one or two more things to this before we start to blend it away, because once we incorporate this sort of cylindrical revolve, it's going to be much more difficult. So what I want to do is I want to take the transition that's happening over here, and I actually want to pull it back a bit farther, just in this one area. And then I'm going to do the same thing here. So we're going to come back, and we're going to come back forward and sort of delete that, and then just take a look. Hide the edges. So now you can see what we did was we took that harder transition. You can see that it's kind of fading back naturally on the top, and then it blends in a bit softer on the side there, and then it goes back to a tighter transition across the bottom. Just by moving those edges out, it gave us that result. I could sit here and I could spend hours and hours just making minor tweaks to the shape, but I don't think that's very helpful at this stage. I think what we want to do now is we want to save it, and then we want to try to incorporate this. Now, as I mentioned, I didn't pre-model or pre-plan this. I just jumped in. So you're seeing the raw process of going through, trying to figure out the shape, make tweaks and make changes. It's not the ideal process. It's not click here, do this. But I feel like it's important to understand that there's a thought process that goes, it's not just the tool, but there's a thought process that always goes into how or why you change an edge or change a shape. And if I pre-do this model, then I already know all of those things and we don't have to work through them. So next part is very tricky. Now, I'm not going to lie, this is going to be tricky because we have to transition the shape that we spent time on into this cylinder. Now, typically what this means for me is I need to find a face or faces where that transition is going to happen. Now, depending on the club, and as I mentioned, I'm not a golfer, but the drivers seem to be closer to the front of the face of the club. And some of the clubs will be a little bit further back, but in general, we're probably going to be transitioning into these two faces. So these edges around those faces. So the way that I'm going to start this is I'm going to select those faces, and I'm going to hold down Alt and extrude them up. So I'm going to just begin pulling them up, sort of rotating this around, and then looking at the shape that was created. Now, the shape could use a bit of work. We can scale things down, we can move it around. But that's generally how I would start to transition a shape like this into another shape. Now, again, we don't have a perfect reference for a golf club, but this is probably how I would go about it. I'm going to select these faces and hit delete, which leaves it open, which is exactly what I want in this case. But before we get too far, we want to look at the topology that was created, because now we've got these star points here. So those star points are typically something we want to be away, kind of away from any drastic changes in curvature. Now this worked out okay because I did have so many edges on the front face. I think that this is okay because it sort of divides the front face away from the club interaction. On your model, if it's a little bit different, you might need to add another edge to sort of get that star point away, but I think it's okay on this design. So now that we have that, I'm going to go to modify and match. This is going to take a T-spline edge, so we're going to double click that. And we want to match the edge of this extrude here. I want to make sure that we have tangency. We can also have curvature continuity, but honestly, in a case like this where it's just a straight line that was revolved, curvature or tangency, it's not going to be that drastic of a difference. If you had something that had some more shape to it, then you probably would notice more of a difference. This looks okay. We also want to think about uniform versus curvature based. Again, in this case, because it is a revolved cylinder, it honestly doesn't make that much of a difference. And the last bit of this thing we want to really think about is this tolerance. When we turn on tolerance, look at how the rest of the model gets subdivided just to match that shape. Now, at this stage in the game, if we're happy with the shape, that's perfectly fine. We don't really need to worry about having too much subdivision because we've already gone through the process. We're already happy with the shape. However, if you do this, it is going to be much harder for you to modify the shape after the fact. So my suggestion, if you're not completely done with the shape, is to not use tolerance and just take a look at this and have it match. Because remember, what we're doing here is this is a destructive environment. We don't have a timeline. We're not capturing anything. So I can still take this edge and I can still move it around. There's nothing keeping it where it is. So keep in mind that if you are not done with the shape, do the match operation, then work on all of the other geometry where this blends into the rest of the body. So for example, if I wanted a tighter transition, this is the time for me to insert another edge and manipulate that shape. So go into box display, maybe double click this edge, move the pivot point, and maybe scale this back. All right, so if we really wanted to focus on that transition shape, we would want to make sure that that was done before we had it subdivide the rest of it. You can see that there are already some problems associated with this. So what I need to do is I need to scale it out some more. I just need to work on the shape. So I'm going to take this edge, and probably just that edge, and move it up. So I manually control that blend. I'm going to take this vertex here, do that. I need to rotate it around, do the same thing over here potentially, depending on how this thing is subdivided. I want to make sure that the transition is well controlled. We don't want it to just do what it wants to do. We want to control it. And then if we're happy with the shape, with all the adjustments that we've made, then now's the time we go back. We use match again. We double click our form's edge. We select the shape we want. We connect it with tangency. We can turn on tolerance, allow it to subdivide, and then we can be happy with the results. The reason that we need to think about tolerance is because in order to get 4 or 5 form faces to match a true cylinder, you need to have some sort of tolerance turned on. Otherwise, it's never going to match. And the whole intent of this is to go back into the design workspace and connect these things together. Another thing to think about is this associative option. Now, the associative option will allow it to match this edge with all the same settings. However, if we decide to move or change or resize it, the form body will update. So you have to really think about where your edges are, the shapes that you're working with and if that's even a valid option. I'm going to leave it on for this case, but keep in mind now this edge is associatively matched and I can't move it. There's no way for me to move it. It's going to be fixed there. All right, so I think we're pretty close to done. I'm not really happy with this transition here. So I want to try to fix that a little bit, which again is very tough now that we've got all this subdivision here. But I think it's a good exercise for us to play around and try to do that. So I'm going to do this with insert point. Now it's probably not typically what you would think, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these edges. It's asking me to unfreeze the edge, so I'm going to say cancel because I don't want it to unfreeze. So maybe if we try some manual manipulation. So I'm going to take maybe these 3 edges, and maybe I'll take these as well. I'm going to set my pivot point over here, and I'm going to scale them down towards me. So I have to pull that edge in. And then I'm going to do the same thing up here. Just grab these 3 edges, reset my pivot point, and scale them down to sort of control that transition there. You can see this one here looks a bit weird. I'm going to pull it in manually. This one here, pull that in manually. And then take a look at it in smooth display. So that looks a little bit better. It doesn't have quite as harsh a transition. Could be better, but I don't think you want to see me spend an hour manipulating that shape. So I think I'm pretty good with that. So I'm going to say okay. Before I exit the form, I'm going to save. Now, keep in mind the last time we finished the form, this was a complete closed form body, which means that it turns into a solid. Now it's open, which means when we convert it, what we have is a surface. Now that's okay. It doesn't matter if it's a solid or a surface. What we can do is we can go to our surface tools, create an offset of this, and then stitch them together. Or when we're in our surface tools, if we delete this, this gets converted to a surface body on all its own. And we can stitch these 2 together. And now we have a solid body version of our club. So that's the basic process, right? I mean, basic is kind of an understatement, but that's the process that you go through to create these types of shapes. Now, it doesn't matter if it's a golf club or if it's a car fender or a helmet. The process is generally the same. You have to look at the same bits of details and you have to really think about the process that you're going through. That's not where I want to leave this though. There are plenty of other things that we can do with this design. So the last couple things that I want to talk about or I want to show have to do with modifications after the form is done. So at this stage with a golf driver, a lot of these will have things like removable weights or additional details that happen. So we're going to talk a little bit about surfacing tools and how to make some of that work. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to create just some sort of shape detail on the top of this. So in order to do that, before I cut anything away or make any changes, I'm just going to offset. I'm going to turn off chain selection, but I'm going to offset this face here and this face because I think I might want to use them. Now, when I say I think I might want to use them, I might want to offset them sort of inward to maybe create a recess. I don't know yet, but a lot of times it's helpful just to have a copy of that. Then I'm going to create a sketch. This is going to be on the top. I'm going to rotate it around. I like viewing it from this orientation for some reason. I'm going to create a straight line here. I'm not going to worry too much about dimensions, but I'm going to create a straight line there. And then I'm going to just come back with a spline. And then I want to take these spline handles. I'm going to make these vertical. And then I want to just sort of play around with the spline shape in here. And what I'm looking to do is roughly match or look like the curvature that we have here. And then I'm going to take this and I want to just extrude it. Now, I don't necessarily know what I want to do at this point, but this is kind of, I want to just make this shape. And I also want to taper it in, see if it'll taper inward or outward. Now, if you can't see it, you can always go back and sort of hide your solid body here. And then here, I want to make sure that it's tapering the other direction. So if you want to go minus 15 in, positive 15 out, you could also simply change where it's starting. Instead of the profile plane, you can start above and just taper down. But so now I have this shape that I'm going to use to cut away from the driver. And I want to take this offset that I did, and I'm going to actually offset it downward a little bit. So I'm going to rotate to maybe a side view. Hopefully I don't kill Fusion doing this. Sometimes it's not very happy offsetting these types of curves. It's thinking pretty hard, so I'm going to cross my fingers that we don't lock it up. All right, so there we go. The reason a lot of times that happens is because this arrow, this manual manipulator, jumps pretty quick from 0 millimeters to 30 or 50 or whatever. And a lot of times that's pretty tough for the software to figure out. So I'm going to just try some numbers. This tells me that it can't offset it. Minus 20 is not working. Let's just try minus 10. All right, that'll work. That'll be okay for our design. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to use trim. I'm going to use the offset surface as my trim tool. I want to get rid of the bottom. I'm going to repeat that process with right click. I'm going to use my extrude as my trim tool, get rid of the outside. And I want to stitch these two things together. We should see a green line all the way around. If you don't, that means you've probably got a gap somewhere. Sometimes you can fix it by increasing the tolerance, but generally you want to go back and just double check, make sure there's not a problem. I'm going to try to fillet this edge, see if it'll allow me to do it. And instead of just using a standard fillet, I want to change it to curvature continuity because I am dealing with some pretty intricate shapes. And then I'm going to adjust the tangency weight. I'm going to try 1.5 just to give it a little bit of a different look. Okay, so that looks okay. So now the reason I did this is because now I've got something I can use, split body. I'm going to split the solid body. I'm going to use my surface tool. And now what we have is this removable weight section. Now that removable weight section, we could then go on to detail this so that there's a screw or some additional features to sort of, kind of set it off. But we used just some basic sketches and basic surface tools to begin to add a bit more detail. We can add fillets. We can try to blend some of this stuff in a little bit. There's going to be a limit to, to what you can do. I'm going to go ahead and add that, and then maybe try, let's see if it'll do 5 millimeters. And then if I hide my edges, you can see there's that recess there matches the top or the outside shape, and it's just sort of sunken in. So you see these kinds of details a lot of times on surface features. Of course, we could go on the front and we could cut away some geometry, and I'll show you that as well. So let's do a sketch. I am going to just do one example of this. I'm just going to do some straight lines here. And I'm going to have one come over here, and I'll do a third one here. And then we'll do some on the other side. And generally what you see is they'll have a round section in the middle where they sort of the sweet spot where they want you to hit. I'm not worried about making sure that these things line up or anything like that. I just want to show you the process. So we have those. Actually, let's go back into that sketch. So we have these lines, and I'm going to try to project them to the surface. So we do project to surface. We want to go to this face and then select our curves. Now you'll notice that it says it's not supported, and this is why I wanted to try this. In Fusion, anytime you want to do an intersection or a projection curve between multiple sketch entities, for whatever reason, you have to create a new sketch. It does not like those sketch features to live in the same sketch. If there's a way to do that I don't know, somebody please comment, let me know. Oftentimes I've thought that maybe enabling 3D Sketch would do it, but as far as I know, that's still not a possibility. But what we've done is we've projected them to this face. The reason I did that is because if the face has any curvature at all, you want to make sure that you project it. Now what we could do is we could take the pipe tool and we can select these edges. and it'll just cut that away. We'll have to show that sketch again, and we'll have to repeat it. We're going to make it the same size each time. The right-click marking menu makes this pretty quick. If you have a feature selected like this, if you just do repeat, it'll automatically OK that. And when you get to the end, you can right-click and go to the right side to OK, and we can hide that sketch. So that's obviously not perfect because the ends aren't rounded. We'd want to round these off, but you know, that's one way that you can do it. You could obviously make curves, and you could take a sphere and sort of drag it along there, but in this case, you know, that gets you pretty close. You know, it gets the design looking pretty close. Again, obviously there's more we could do. We've already spent an hour on this, so I don't want to kill a bunch of time doing these sorts of things, but hopefully you can see with some basic tools, some basic surfacing, things like split body, we can have a removable counterweight. We can add some intricate features if we take the time to build those with surfaces. And you can also have multiple form bodies. If you want a form surface that you want to use to cut away, then you certainly can do that. If you have any questions on this, please let me know. Again, this wasn't really planned out. I wanted to show the process of how I would go about sort of modeling something like this. This data set is going to be in the link in the description, so if you want to get in there and play around with it, you can still go back and edit the form body. Unfortunately, you won't be able to go back and sort of go to the point where you don't have all the subdivision. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to a previous version, maybe, and also put that link in so you can go to the one that has lower resolution on it. But if you have any questions, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.